With Westminster roiling, widespread anger up and down the country, it's also a critical moment for the Labour Party. Having bided its time in recent months, the leadership has now called for Boris Johnson to resign. And the party's taken a commanding lead in the polls, consistently 10 or more points ahead of the Conservatives. So with an election potentially less than 2 years away, is Labour ready for government? I'm joined now by the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. Now, Wes Streeting, if your leader gets his way, you'd be Health Secretary sooner rather than later. So could we just dispense with the bit where I say, ask you about something and then you tell me what's wrong with the government's actions and go straight to the part where I ask you this. Given all the signs are that the Omicron wave, though not gone, is less dangerous than it was, would you be inclined, if you were Health Secretary, to relax the current restrictions at the next review on January 26th?
Well, we'll follow the data closely. We hope so, in that we don't want any more restrictions or measures than are absolutely necessary. I think the cautionary note we've got to bear in mind is that London might be over the peak of the wave. The rest of England is still bearing the brunt of it. And for lots of reasons, particularly population size, capacity and resilience, London's NHS system is in a stronger position than other parts of the NHS. So we can't be complacent about that. What I have done today, though, is send a very strong message to the country about the need to live well with COVID. And we've heard lots of Conservative MPs talk about living with COVID, and my anxiety about that has been two fronts. There are some Conservative backbenchers for whom living with COVID means ending all measures, including the testing regime and everything else. That's reckless and irresponsible. You've got the Health Secretary who says we need to live with COVID but doesn't seem to have a plan. So we set out 10 points that we think the government should introduce in order to live well with COVID in the longer term. Some are things they should do immediately, some are longer term objectives, but the goal here is to make sure that we never have to go into lockdown again and that we can move forward as a country protecting public health, but doing so in a way that protects lives, livelihoods and liberties.
So, in effect, you are already preparing for, as it were, the shift from a pandemic to endemic.
Yes, and I think that's the sensible thing to do. And you're right to say at the outset, we can't be complacent. We're following the data. I was reassured, actually, by what Oliver Dowden said about following the data, because I'll be honest, my anxiety reading the Sunday papers this morning was that this stuff about ending Plan B measures was driven more by the politics of the situation, Boris Johnson's personal political problems, needing to throw some red meat to backbenchers who might be writing the letters in, and trying to say, let's move on from the Downing Street parties onto Plan B measures and grab some headlines. So I want the government to be motivated by public health. And as you'll remember from when I came on before Christmas, one of the reasons why we signalled Labour support for Plan B measures well in advance of the vote was to give the Health Secretary the confidence to know he had the votes. So my message to him this morning, regardless of all the noise about Boris Johnson and the mess he's caused for his own party and government, let's keep public health at the forefront of our minds and let's plan on that basis.
Well, it's rather difficult to avoid the mess that, as you described it, that Mr Johnson's caused, if you want to put it that way. And just in passing, I apologise to viewers if I brought something personal into this discussion. Let's try and keep above that. Now, your party's obviously benefited from the revelations that have been coming out day after day. But let's just clear up one thing, because it came up yesterday. Your own leader's not averse to a quick snifter during the working day, is he?
There's no comparison between Keir Starmer following the rules in 2021 and Boris Johnson breaking the rules in 2020. No comparison whatsoever. And I understand why the Conservative Party, unable to defend Boris Johnson, wants to now start going on the attack and smearing other people to cause distraction. But there is genuinely no comparison between the two. And I think what we've got to do is to show, going back to the point about the politics, that it's not enough for Labour for the government to lose the next election. We've got to earn trust and win the next general election. And by the way, Trevor, I don't think you should apologise for talking about your personal pain, because millions of people up and down the country are having the same conversation. It's come up on the doorstep time and time again in recent days. And I think that image we saw of the Queen isolating, the reason why that image is so powerful is two fronts. One, it showed that people were following the rules. And if Her Majesty the Queen, who is actually genuinely the only person in the country who is legally above the law, thought it was important to follow the rules and set an example, why did the Prime Minister think that somehow he was above the rules? And what the Queen has done, as she often does, is epitomise a national mood and a national moment, and she took that responsibility seriously in the way the Prime Minister didn't. So I think people are furious and hurt. And actually one of the most powerful interviews I heard this week was a caller into a radio programme who was in bits because he'd enforced the rules at funerals and was now asking if he'd done the right thing and felt terribly guilty about it. And that's what the Prime Minister either doesn't understand or doesn't care about, was that people were doing the right thing. We were all in it together. Boris Johnson and Number 10 weren't, and that's why he's unfit for office.
Against that background, and, you know, we don't have to argue about what you've just said, it's curious that, you know, Labour has said, rhetorically, Prime Minister must resign, but why is there no vote of confidence? Why are you leaving this to Tory backbenchers to sort out?
Well, I think there are three routes to the Prime Minister going. He could do the right thing and resign, but Boris Johnson and doing the right thing rarely appear in the same sentence. He can be removed by Conservative MPs through a motion of no confidence through the 1922 committee, and I understand more letters are coming in, but they're not there yet. Or he can be removed by the electorate. Those are the three routes to the Prime Minister going. And I think what Conservative MPs need to weigh up very carefully is whether, in the end, they are going to allow a toxic, radioactive Prime Minister to contaminate their party. Because one of the reasons I push back on the idea that they're all the same is that when things like this happen in politics, sometimes the voters do say you're all the same. I don't think we're all the same. I don't think most Conservative MPs were out breaking the rules. But voters will judge them if they defend the indefensible, if they stand by the Prime Minister, if they're complicit by their silence. And that's why they should remove him, because otherwise the voters will remove them at the next general election.
But hang on, I don't really understand this. I mean, one of the routes is a vote of no confidence in Parliament, which you could instigate. Why aren't you doing it?
Well, we could bring forward a motion of no confidence in the government. We've been around the blocks with this before. That would galvanise the Conservative Party. That would be the political dynamics.
How do you know that? You don't know that until you try it.
I just don't think that's true. I mean, I know Tory MPs well enough, Trevor, to know the way they behave. They don't want to bring down the Conservative government. I imagine they are concluding in their own minds and judgment and in their own consciences that Boris Johnson is unfit for office. The question now is whether they have the courage to act.
Well, look, I don't want to seem overly cynical here, Mr. Streeting, but actually there is a point of view that says that the people who most benefit from having Boris Johnson deeply wounded, damaged, but still in office is the Labour Party, and that actually, for you, having him clinging on in Number 10 is better for you as a party, even if getting him out you think would be better for the country. And all of this rhetoric is really just a way of making sure he stays there.
No, so I'm make no bones about it. Boris Johnson carrying on is great for the Labour Party. If I'm thinking about this purely through the prism of party politics, my message to Tory MPs is keep him on, knock yourselves out. Literally, you'll be knocked out at the next election. But we're still in the middle of a national crisis here, and the Prime Minister's actions and judgments matter. In fact, it comes back to the point I made about Plan B measures. If a Prime Minister or a Health Secretary from the Conservative Party is coming forward and saying we're going to remove Plan B measures, I want to be absolutely confident they're making that decision in the national interest and not in the party interest for party management reasons. I don't have total confidence about that. It's one of the reasons why in the coming days I'll be talking to leaders of the NHS and talking to government scientists and other scientists to get their independent, impartial view, because I can't trust that at the moment ministers are guided by one principle and one principle alone, which is public health before party politics. So this is not good for the country. I think Boris Johnson ought to go in the national interest. I know we'll be stuck with a Conservative government for a bit longer, and I hope it is just a bit longer. And the responsibility ultimately falls on us to show the voters that we're not complacent, we're not waiting for government to fall into our laps. We don't think it's the case that because the Tories are in a mess that people just flock to Labour by default. We want to win people's trust. I mean, that's why yesterday Keir Starmer did a big speech about the future of health and social care. He could have just banged on about Boris Johnson for 20 minutes and everyone would have loved it. But he did that speech to show the country that Labour has a plan, Labour has a vision for the country, Labour is ready for government.
Indeed. Well, he's made speeches like that before, and it doesn't seem to be working, because this morning's opinion poll, which puts you 10 points ahead as a party, has a rather interesting finding. And let me just quote what the Director of Research at Opinion says. When we tested possible successors to Johnson, while most of the Cabinet got negative ratings, nearly half of people say they think Rishi Sunak would be a good Prime Minister, a figure that is higher than both Labour's vote share and Keir Starmer's approval rating. So actually, your vote lead is really more to do with Johnson's unpopularity than the idea that the voters have had a come to Jesus moment with Labour and discovered that Labour is what they're looking for.
Well, we're absolutely not complacent. Keir is not complacent. Whenever we get new polls out showing a Labour lead, Keir is the first person to say, we're not looking at this through rose-tinted glasses. We've got work to do still to win back trust. But that's why in the new year, he did a big speech outlining his vision for the country and the principles that would underpin a Labour government, followed up very quickly by a substantial speech about health and social care. You'll be hearing more about this from Keir and from the rest of the shadow cabinet over this year, because this is the year where we will be saying to the country, we've got a terrible government, the country deserves a better alternative. Here is Labour's alternative, and that's where we'll be in 2022. All
right, one quick last question. Labour backbencher Barry Gardiner received over £400,000 from a source linked to the Chinese Communist Party for his political work. Will he and any other MP who benefited from that kind of money be required to return it by the Labour Party?
I don't know that we can require him to return it. I do think this is very serious. I do think that we've got a real issue here, which extends beyond one Labour MP. It's also about access to government ministers. That's why, to be honest, both of our parties aren't treating this as a party political knockabout. It's being taken very seriously by the leadership of both parties. We can't have a situation where a foreign government, particularly one hostile to Britain's interests on a number of levels, is able to directly interfere in our politics. That's what we've got to draw a line under. And I hope that very quickly we will be having a full review of what's happened, the lessons that need to be learned. We also need to act very quickly. Yes. The Intelligence Security Committee made a whole number of recommendations in relation to the Russia report. Many of those haven't yet been implemented. So I think there's an urgency to act. National security has got to come first.
Wes Streeting, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.